I'm John Denham, and I'm the director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics. In a previous life, I was a Labour MP and Cabinet Minister. The upheavals of the last 10 years would have surprised any political observer who was around in 2010. But in this time, we've chosen to leave the European Union, and we've seen a steady advance of a Conservative Party that now has a large majority. These huge upheavals, which have consequences for the politics of England, the United Kingdom, and for Europe, have essentially happened in England and amongst English voters. The bulk of voters who voted Leave were in England, and they were primarily people who emphasised their English identity. And it's very largely the same voters who delivered Boris Johnson's election victory last December. At the Centre for English Identity and Politics, we want to try to understand the role of the English in these recent political events. It's a phenomenon that I'll call political Englishness. Now, in England, about 9 out of 10 people place themselves on a scale that runs from English not British, through more English than British, equally English than British, more British than English, British not English. About 30% say they are English or more English, 40% equally English and British, and about 20% are more British or British not English. So there's a distinct skewing of the spectrum towards English identity in England. The 10% who don't go on that scale, they either don't know or they have a national identity from outside the United Kingdom or a different United Kingdom identity. When I talk about political Englishness, I mean voters who don't just emphasise their English identity, but who also broadly share a similar worldview and a tendency to vote in similar ways. Now, 20 years ago, if we look back at elections, none of this seemed to matter. There was no pattern about how English or British voters voted. But by the time of the EU referendum, 70% of the English not British voted Leave, and round about 70% of the British not English voted Remain. The equally English and British split pretty equally. And the advance of the Conservative Party from 2010 was largely amongst English and more English voters. Boris Johnson's victory, the Get Brexit Done election, was almost entirely based on this group. Now, national identity is a set of stories, histories, images, shared experiences that enables people to see each other as people like us who come from this place. So why did English people develop this distinct outlook and these political choices? We don't understand every part of the process, but there are perhaps a few key factors. Many are working class voters in declining industrial areas outside the cities or former prosperous seaside towns. They drifted away from an increasingly middle-class Labour Party that they didn't feel stands for people like me anymore. Their idea of Englishness was rooted in their strong communities, so immigration was more concerning to their identity. Devolution made them feel more English, but they thought devolution favoured Scotland. Their idea of democracy and sovereignty centred on the nation, not the EU. They felt excluded too from power and voice within this country. They prioritise England over the Union, and they want political parties to stand up for English interests. They want English laws made by English MPs in the same way that Scotland and Wales have made their own laws. Though voting to the right recently, these voters often have left-wing economic views, and they want more investment in public services. One big paradox is that no one talks about England or the English, despite their importance. Politicians tend to talk about the country or Britain, even when they mean England. Mainstream politicians are largely British nationalists who think that talking about England will undermine the Union. And England, of course, does not have a national forum to make its laws, or a place where it can reimagine itself for the 21st century. Some critics of the English often say they're English nationalists or claim that they're all racist, far right or xenophobic. But this doesn't really stack up with the facts. The idea that English identity is race-based is wrong. Unlike British or Scottish identity, neither the state nor politicians have tried to encourage an inclusive English identity, but it is making its own way there. Only a shrinking minority of the more English now think you have to be white to be English, and that number halved between 2012 and 2017. It is true, though, that in the absence of a campaign to make Englishness feel like an inclusive identity, BAME people are still much less likely to identify as English. It's also A strange sort of nationalism that has no party, no leaders, no political programme, no public intellectuals or national cultural institutions. And that's why political Englishness is a much more accurate term. Now, if we look at the aspirations of the political English, we can see why Euroscepticism and its emphasis on taking back control and national democracy was attractive. But on the other hand, those politicians don't meet the needs of the aspirations of the political English on issues like economic policy or public services. For all the talk of levelling up, it's not clear whether the current government is willing to use the tools needed to make it a reality. So one of the big questions for the future is whether the political English stay with the Conservatives, whether they might drift towards a more populist party on the right that has more emphasis on nation, is more immigration sceptic, or can these voters be attracted back to a left of centre Labour Party that is once again more interested in listening to the views of working class voters? These are the sort of issues that I hope we'll continue to track in the centre at Southampton University.